Oh, here we are again discussing all things divorce and separation. Hello to you again, Jeff. Straight off the bat, we often hear the words divorce and expensive spun together. Why is that? And can you maybe break down some of those costs for us?
Sure. Well, I think there's sort of two elements to why we talk about divorce being expensive. The one is, of course, when people separate, they have to resolve issues in relation to property and also in relation to the care of children. And usually there's some reason for a breakup and some degree of conflict. And it's hard to get people to have a meeting of minds to sensibly resolve those divisions. And if people need assistance, for example, through lawyers in resolving property matters, it can take time, and time unfortunately costs money to resolve that. The range of that can be, from a few $1,000s to tens of thousands.
So, if a person or a couple are happy to use the online solution for a divorce, what exactly are the costs for them?
So let's talk about two parts of that. So, firstly, if I can mention the other arm of separation is the legal ending of the marriage or getting a divorce. And you can achieve that through trying to lodge a divorce application yourself, which obviously minimises cost. You can go and see a solicitor at an office and they will usually indicate to you roughly what a divorce might cost, either as a fixed fee or an hourly rate, which lawyers commonly use. But the online solution might be that through completing an online application and an orderly dealing of things, that they may save themselves quite an amount of money by undertaking an online divorce solution, which is just as effective at the end of the day, but also cost effective to them.
So, in a previous episode, we spoke about documenting a property settlement. So, what about the cost for that? Can you take us through what that looks like?
Sure. So when we look at a property settlement, there's probably three things that happen in a property settlement. So if a couple who've separated have very modest assets, they might have a couple of cars and some furniture, there's probably not much they need to do to write that down and say, well, I'm keeping car A and you're keeping car B. And so they have a very modest cost to sort things out. If you sort of move up the ramp a little bit and you've got mum and dad who might have a house and some cars and some superannuation they built up over the 18 years they were together, then they normally would need to document that in some way. By technically, we would call that either consent orders filed with the court or another document called a binding financial agreement, either way prepared by lawyers usually. You can spend a couple of $1,000 up to $10,000 depending on complexity and having that paperwork prepared. The last version, of course, is then having a court process for the umpire, i.e. the judge, to tell you how much each of you should get and what assets are to be divided in those high conflict matters, which tend to be actually probably less than 1 in 100 separations. But you will spend, on average, $30,000 to $50,000 each if you want to have a judge tell you the final solution, and probably spend a couple of years of your life waiting for that to occur.
So on that, like not everything always goes to plan, and not everything is smooth sailing in a divorce or when you're trying to split assets. So how do you deal in the situation where couples just cannot agree on how to split property or their assets?
Well, let's go back to first principles. So if the parties need to identify firstly, what are the assets they need to divide? So that do you really know how much cash you've got in the bank, how much superannuation each party has, what's the value of the house or the cars? So when you've got an asset pool worked out, then you can actually start, well, how do we best discuss dividing it? So can we sit down together and have a chat? If there's a bit of conflict, do we have a third party, a good friend, sit down over a cup of tea and work through that assets and what might be a sensible outcome between you? If you can't talk because there's more conflict, then can you write between each other and actually set out what your proposals might be backwards and forwards? And then we go down to the two roads, essentially, a mediation road potentially, or through a lawyer road, and sometimes they intersect.
So can you explain a little bit of technical detail for us? So in a property settlement, how does the money actually change hands?
Well, let's take a step back first. I might just elaborate a little bit more on the property and mediation a little bit more. So What's a mediation? So mediation usually is an independent person. Sometimes it's a lawyer, sometimes it's a person who's trained in negotiation, who sits down with the parties and helps them, again, identify what the assets are, looks at some issues about how a sensible outcome can be reached, and tries to then use common sense ultimately to then work out whether a sensible property settlement can occur. From a lawyer's point of view, a similar process normally occurs, i.e. proposals are made based on identifying what the assets are. And interestingly, now, as part of the act under which lawyers have to divide things, a mediation is usually a compulsory step before you can actually file for court proceedings. So, all in all, there'll be several steps before anyone can go to court to resolve their property matters. So you may end up with mum with a lawyer, dad with a lawyer, and a mediator, probably another lawyer, all sitting down trying to negotiate a solution that helps them move forward. And while the expense of that may be potentially several $1,000s, it's certainly cheaper than having a court process at the end of the day.
So we know that you're an avid reader and podcast listener. Can you give us some tips on dealing with the emotional toil that can come with going through a divorce or a property settlement to help those people get through it a little bit easier?
Yeah, I'd love to. But I didn't answer one of your questions, interestingly. You said, how do we actually practically divide up the assets at the end of the day? So as I mentioned before, when we get to the point where you might have reached an agreement through a mediation or a negotiation through solicitors, you then usually document that. And I mentioned that you can do that by consent orders or a binding financial agreement. Those orders might set out in a practical sense to say, well, look, mum is going to have her transferred to her the house, and she's going to give dad $50,000 and refinance a loan with the ANZ. And they'll put a time frame on that so that mum then has to go to the bank within, say, 45 days and arrange that money, that she becomes the sole person who's on the mortgage, and dad will sign the transfer papers for the house. Both of them sign some transfer papers to do with, say, some cars, and if necessary, they might agree to divide up some superannuation so they have an equal amount as well. And there's a process to go through. But the key is you need to document that in writing, and there are some advantages in doing so, for example, in relation to stamp duty. I won't go into that today because it's a bit complicated, but to create some finality and sometimes to save you some money, it's actually better to have a final agreement. So that was the property stuff, but I did jump away from your question about wellness. So let's talk about that again. I think everything is tied together. Your financial health and your emotional and mental health are pretty important. So I think there's three really important things that I think about when I'm talking to clients. The first one is let's get things out of your head and let's write things down. So some people call it journaling. Some people might want to just be tapping some notes into their phone, but it's better to write things down at 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. About thoughts, whatever thoughts that might be, because it gets that out of your head temporarily, and then you may be able to action it later on when it's appropriate to deal with some issues that might be arising, whether it's the care of one of the kids, whether it's a thought about how you might divide up your property. That was my first thought. Another one is, of course, listen to things, learn, become a sponge, not necessarily from a circle of friends who may not fully know things, but get into some really good things like podcasts. I'm a big fan of podcasts and that might be to do with meditation, it might be to do with recovering from trauma, and a separation is a form of trauma. But there are numerous podcasts out there, for example, that you could listen to while you're moving around and doing other things that might help your wellness generally as well.
And the third thing, you said you had three key things to help people get through a divorce or a property settlement. Don't leave us hanging. What's the third thing?
All right, move. I'll say it 3 times. I'm a massive fan of movement. Humans are designed to be mobile creatures, and sitting at home thinking about things too much, or spending time on social media, or watching television, you've got to get a routine of movement. And if you can, you've got children, involve them in it as well. So get out there, go for a walk, go for a bike ride, sit by the seaside, whatever is important to you. But I think you've got to move, and move regularly, because there's lots of good science reasons why that's the case, and possibly everything from weight management to mental health movement is fantastic.
Well, that's great. As we come to the end of another episode, two last quick ones for you. You mentioned that you're an avid podcast listener. Give us your favourite podcast to listen to.
Well, I think I've been listening to a fellow called Tim Ferriss for the longest. He's a business podcast and a lifestyle business podcast man who interviews lots of interesting people who talk about their life journeys and give you tips for wellness and the like. The other one is the Howie Games. I'm a bit of a sports buff, and Mark Howard, who's the leader of the Howie Games, is a sports commentator, but he interviews lots of interesting people, both in the sports world, but sometimes the arts fields as well. And I find some of those interviews both illuminating and quite entertaining.
And your favourite way to move? Best form of exercise that you enjoy doing the most?
Best form for me as a retired footballer, I suppose, who doesn't kick too many footballs anymore, is running. I like to run. I like to walk. So getting out in the fresh air and working up a bit of a sweat has been always my favourite way of exercising.
Very good. Well, as always, Jeff, thanks for joining us again and informing us more on divorce and property settlement. And until next time, we'll see you later.
Thanks, Dane. We'll talk again very soon.